Hi everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Tonight's story, Pop Burgess. Hello there. It was about 1909 when a well-built fellow with a slight stoop on his shoulders got off the train at the Aberdeen Railroad Station and inquired the way to the Washington Hotel. The porter who drove the hotel bus spoke up promptly and took his bags, and a few minutes later the newcomer was signing the register, Bernard F. Burgess. A week later he had moved his wife Sally and their young daughter to town, and people were asking each other if they had met the new family that had moved in. He's going to manage the Pacific Lumber Inspection Bureau, they told each other, and that was just about all the folks knew about the man who was about to spend the rest of his life becoming one of the town's best-known citizens. Burgess took a desk in the Inspection Bureau office in the Finch building, joined the Elks Lodge, and minded his own business. And Grays Harbor was a long time learning the story behind the man, but eventually the yarn came out, as salty and full-living a yarn as any man could boast for backlogs. For the man who was to be familiarly known as Pop Burgess to the later generation of harborites was a man with a story. He had been logged with the lumberjacks of Quebec and Manitoba, ridden with the Canadian Mounted Police as one of them, hiked the Athabasca Trail to the roaring Yukon, and piloted the river steamer in Dawson. He had lived through the most riotous years of the Klondike gold hunt, been up and down on his luck like a spring thermometer, faced danger, starvation, and perils of the Arctic, and lived to tell it all from a chair at the Aberdeen Elks Club. Pop Burgess, we'll call him that, it was the name that Grays Harbor knew best. Pop Burgess was a sourdough if there was ever one, and he came by the title rightly and honestly, for he saw the Alaskan stampede from the bottom up. He was born in Canada, and at the age of 17 was hacking timber with the conch woodsmen of the Gatineau lumber camps of Quebec. From there, he worked his way into northern Manitoba, a wild and God-forsaken area in the late 1880s. There, he became a fur buyer for Carsiden and Peck, and for 3 years, he covered the wilderness from Oxford to York Factory on James Bay. It was on that work that Pop learned about boats, an education that was to pay off someday far away. He used canoes in the crossing of lakes, and he held the tiller of the yoke boats, the clinker-built crafts that were designed to carry about 3.5 tons of freight and were propelled by 8 oarsmen. Sometimes they used a square sail. Pop used to squint his eyes a bit, a better looking backwards and sigh. It was a pretty sight to see the fleet of those boats coming across the lake, he said, all in line with their oars flashing. Pop compared them to ancient Viking crafts. Well, Pop Burgess was a pretty well-known lad in the Canadian outpost when word got around of the gold strike in the Yukon. Gold, they said, was here for the picking. In Vancouver, Pop and a friend, Frank Dixon, sat down one night and talked about it, and 2 days later they hit out for Edmonton with the intention of taking the Athabasca Trail and overland route to the gold country. They picked up an outfit and made first jaunt of the trip that was to take them 13 months over 2,500 miles of God's wildest country through the adventures that they had never dreamed of. From Edmonton, it was a 97-mile jaunt to Athabasca Landing and jumping off place for the trip into the Arctic. The trail was by water from there, down the river to the Athabasca Lake, but when they arrived, the river was still frozen. They waited 3 weeks for the ice to break, but not alone. Hundreds of others camped alongside the river, working on their canoes and camping out to be gold hunters. It was May 3rd, 1898, when the river had cleared enough to permit the voyagers to launch their canoe and start the long trip. They were filled with the enthusiasm and anticipation of adventure. They waved and shouted to the left-behinders on shore and struck paddles into the chilly waters of the river. But they had no idea what lay ahead. There was 740 miles of river through the wildest of wilderness country. After a day or two, Pop recalled, they paddled into a wide-eyed sleep. Their hands became talons around the paddles. Black flies from the banks of the stream came to the middle of the river to harass them, and at night the roar of mosquitoes in their ears was like a horde of great engines. The forest never changed. Once in a while there was a portage across the rapids or falls, and then they met other gold seekers. They shared the trials with others, moving boats and baggage around the rough waters, and the river banks at night was bright as fires, and the sound of many tongues and many voices. They saw wild game in profusion. At one point they camped in a natural gas field where several seeps had been lit and were being used as cooking fires by the travelers. Toward Lake Athabasca, the country changed somewhat, and then they began to paddle over the smooth waters of the Great Northern Lake, 195 miles long. They crossed the lake diagonally to Rochester River, heading for the Great Salve River, which flowed 250 miles northward to the Great Salve Lake. From the mouth of the river, it was 125 miles of open water across to the end of the Great Salve Lake. It was one of the great milestones, Pop recalled, on their push into the North Country. From the lake on the north, it was to be the Mackenzie River, one of the great rivers of the world, and one that flowed on north into the Arctic. Pop and his companions followed it to Fort Simpson. Here they were to leave it, but since they jumped off at the Athabasca River, they had to hike and paddle more than 1,250 miles. But they were a long way short of their goal. There was a long uphill pull to Laird Post, 525 miles westward, towards the distance of the Rockies. And before they had completed it, winter had come. They were frozen in, and there would be no crossing into the Yukon until next spring. There were 120 men in the camp where Pop spent the winter. Some were on their way in, others on their way out. The latter had had enough. Their gold fever had run its course. Pop learned that they had left behind 1,400 pounds of beans, a half-ton of sugar, and mountains of other food. They had abandoned their shovels, gold pans, and other equipment. The Indians picked up the miners' equipment, and for 2 years didn't trap a rabbit. They lived off the miners' abandoned stores. Meanwhile, Pop and his partners built a shack, shot a couple of moose, and settled down for the winter. It was a long winter. When the weather would permit, they hunted. Otherwise, they just sat and waited. It lasted 5 months. They comforted themselves with the knowledge that on the other side, over the Yukon, it was too cold for digging. There would be plenty of gold left for them. When they started out again, it was March 21st, 1899. They had a dog team purchased from the postmaster at Laird Post. They finished their last lap into Dawson in 2 months and 2 weeks. They had been on the trail from Edmonton 13 months, 1 day, and 6 hours. The Fargo dealer was Jim, blinked like he looked up from his game. "For Lord's sake, kid, where'd you come from?" he asked, squinting at 29-year-old Pop Burgess. Pop told him the all-Canadian route from Athabasca. "You look like it," said the man. "Go buy yourself a drink," he snorted, and pushed $20 in a chip across the board to the tenderfoot. And on that day, Pop Burgess became part of the toiling, roaring, stomping backwash of the world that populated the Yukon during the gold rush. Pop recalled that the till his last day. There were 50,000 people stowed away in that part of the world, either mining or living off the miners, he said. They were bearded sourdoughs and a nattily dressed gambler, promoters, and dance hall operators. Dawson was wide open. There were dance halls and gambling places everywhere. Gambling operated all day and all night. Saloons roared around the clock, but in every dive there was a watchman of the law and order, a Royal Northwest Police just in case. Crooked gamblers got short-shifted. Claim jumpers received summary treatment. It was in this famous bar known as Jim's that Pop met some Royal Mounted Police whom he had known in Quebec, and a few days later, after trying his luck at a few times at odd jobs, he applied for a post enlistment. That was how Pop Burgess happened to pull on the blue uniform of the Mounties with a yellow stripe down the trousers. It was a blue uniform instead of red in those days. And for 5 months, Pop was an arm of the law in the roughest part of the world where law enforcement was hard to enforce. When he next changed jobs, it was to drive a dog team for the Canadian Development Company hauling the mail. That Pop recalled was the toughest job he had ever had. 4 days to make 28 miles to Minto, and at times the temperature dropped to 70 degrees below zero during the winter that followed. From the Royal Mail, Pop went to steamboating. His boat experience as a young man on the lakes of eastern Canada had prepared him for it, and his 2,000 miles in a canoe through the wilderness country taught him how to be a judge of a river. When the Yukon became navigable following the spring, Pop became a pilot for the Alaska Commercial Steamship Company steamers. That was to finish his work in the frozen north. For 2 summers, he ran the river for 1,600 miles up and down to become one of the best-known riverboat pilots in the business. Pop saved his money, that is, most of it, which was unusual for the men who populated the frozen north. And when he had time, he talked with northern men about places to land when things slowed down there. He talked with other men. There were 2, Griffin and Johnson, who operated the Northern Cafe in Dawson, charging $5 for a tenderloin steak and $2.50 for a couple of eggs with bacon. Pop later ran across them down this way, for they had opened the Washington Hotel, where he registered that night in 1909. Working on the Canadian river boats, he met a man named E.A. Morak, who was chief steward of the company's vessel. Morak was someday to buy out the other 2 men in the Washington Hotel and eventually build and lend his name to Aberdeen's biggest hostelry. Tex Rickard and Alexander Pantages were numbered among his friends, and it was in Dawson that he met Jack Perry, a man of many world adventures who had just returned from the Philippines. A former Aberdeen man, Perry was the brother of Maud Perry Douglas, beloved Aberdeen pioneer. A pilot on the river was Pop. With Pop was Jack Doddridge, brother of a pioneer Aberdeen barber. The late Tom McKay, for years an Aberdeen attorney, was a prospector in Bear Gulch, and Tom's soul of hookworm was prodding around the creeks when Pop wore the uniform of a Mountie. The late Tom Haynes of Aberdeen was also a river pilot, and Dewey Gotek was later operated the Fairmount Cafe, ran the Dewey Hotel in Dawson. Doc Hoover of Aberdeen had a claim at 40 Mile. And all of them, Pop Burgess got a picture of the harbor country. When Pop came out in 1903, he headed for this northwest country, and he got his first roots down at Point Blakely, where he took a job tallying lumber. He made lumber his business from that day on, and in 1909 came to Aberdeen to manage the Inspection Bureau. And in more than 30 years that he lived among us, Pop became somewhat a figure, and during his last years as a fixture at the entrance to the Elks Club Room, he had time to sit and talk. He liked to tell a yarn, and his stories were filled with all the salt of sweat of the doings of the days that men never knew again, and the trials that they trace from the lumber camps of Quebec through the cold, wild Arctic, inevitably, which led him to Gray's Harbor, which Pop always decided was the best place of all. But the other was good too, Pop often said. The Yukon makes magnificent memories and great pages for our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.